We're in a series called Bringing Life to the City. It's in the book, we're going through the book of Nehemiah, which is actually a book about restoring a city. And we'll be in chapter 2 today. But each week we've been having, just sharing out of the congregation, stories of how God is moving among us, stories of how God is bringing life into our city through our congregation in the last couple months. And this morning I'm going to invite Patrick up. Please give Patrick a warm welcome. He's not only head of the Tabernacle team, but has been pioneering the Hillcrest outreach team for some time now, and is involved with a group called HRC. Patrick, tell us just a little bit about what is HRC for those of us who do not know.
Yeah, human rights campaign, actually. If you know from the sticker, my wife told me, make sure you mention the sticker. And so it's a blue sticker with yellow equality sign on it. And so it's actually the biggest LGBT organization, actually, I think, in the world, but I could be wrong about that, in the States at least. So, yeah. So
it's San Diego based.
And it's San Diego. Well, it's actually national, and so they're very big on advocating for LGBT rights with government. So it's a huge governmental LGBT rights organization. So.
And what is your role with HRC right now?
Right now, I'm actually on the Faith Outreach Co-Chair. I'm part of the Faith Outreach Co-Chair. What that means is essentially I'm trying to reach out to faith communities on behalf of HRC to kind of help them think through and dialogue about LGBT-related issues, actually. And
how did you ever get on their steering committee as the Faith Outreach Co-Chair?
Yeah, so I was actually invited into it about 3 years ago. My wife and I moved to Hillcrest, and we actually, just to the heart of the church here, our church is just to go out into the community, right? And so I was on that kind of call, just doing it, and I met a gal out there, and she became a friend of ours. She came to dinner, she came to different things, and long story short, she essentially she knew that we had moved to Hillcrest because we didn't think the church had done a good job reaching out to the LGBTQ, and so when she heard that, and we had like a lot of extensive conversations with her, she started reading the Bible with us and doing all kinds of stuff. And essentially, it came to a place where she was like, Patrick, I'm going to invite him into doing this with me. So she's been involved with the Human Rights Campaign for about, I don't even know, for years now. And she just invited me. I've been on it for about 1.5 years now, so doing it.
And how has it felt to work alongside friends in that capacity?
It's edgy a lot of times, but actually I was more afraid and apprehensive before going in. I had more edge going into it because didn't know how much I could line up with this particular organization. Jamie was kind of like, man, God's doing something here, and so it kind of helped me see it. But it's been really good, though. I think in a lot of ways, I'm finding places where we can intersect and we can actually have commonality, and I'm really surprised how much commonality I've been able to find with a group that I wouldn't think I'd have that much commonality with, actually.
Awesome. Let's give Patrick a hand, and I want to encourage some of you could follow up with Patrick, but one thing I want to highlight on that story is that God's opening doors in places we might not expect. He's opening doors. It would be, 3 years ago, I might have been surprised to find out a member of Coast and a leader at Coast is on the steering committee, which is sort of like the board of the largest LGBT nonprofit in the nation. That's one of those things that if you tried to plan for that, it would be really hard to get there. But God opened a door, and God's doing something. I don't think we have everything figured out in terms of what God's doing, but God is up to something. That's a door that doesn't open on its own. I'll give you one more example before we look at Nehemiah together of just how God opens doors. Some of you have heard part of this story before. A couple years ago, a couple of us from Coast were at the mosque for a meeting on justice. It was a room almost full of Muslims from around the world. Some of you know that the mosque next door to us is multinational. I think about 140 languages are spoken there, and all different sort of groups within Islam are represented there. So it was a room full of basically the nations and a room full of almost every imaginable part of Islam. And as the Imam Taha, many of us know him now, was speaking, and he stopped at one point and said, and now Jamie's going to come up and share about what Jesus would say about justice. And he hadn't told me that in advance. And I thought, now this is one message. If I knew I was going to have this opportunity, I would have prayed for like a year. I would have read 15 books and studied the whole Bible and gotten ready, but it was just like, boom, and now Jamie's going to come up. So as I'm walking up, I'm like, what am I going to say? Is this a joke, God? Like, what have you done to me? And I went back to the very first message I ever preached at Coast, because it's like those things you do as a kid, like riding a bike. Like, what can I say? First message, Good Samaritan. And I've spoken on it a bunch of times. And so I just started talking about the Good Samaritan. Some wonderful stuff happened. But walking out into the parking lot, I had a feeling of like overwhelming joy. And I had two thoughts that came to mind as I was walking to my car. One was, what just happened? You know, like if a group of pastors had gotten together and for a year had strategized, how can we like share the gospel of Jesus at the largest mosque in San Diego County? I don't think we would have had any ideas, right? Like, how do you plan for that? That's not something that strategy, like one step after another, leads to. And so I had a real sense of like, what just happened there? And a real sense like, God, that's a door you must have opened, Jesus, because that door would not have opened on its own. And the other thought I had was, that was so fun. And this is a little window into my broken brain. As I was getting to the car, I thought, man, this is like when I used to do drugs, this is what I was looking for. Like, I wanted adventure. I wanted a sense like there's got to be meaning out there. And so there's part of getting high that was like, life has to have more adventure than just driving to the grocery store, getting your groceries, going home, living in the suburbs. Like, life, there must be something more significant. And there's like an edge. Like the thing that when I read The Hobbit, I'm like, yes, I want to be in that story, you know? But there's a part of me, the drugs were chasing a sense of being alive and adventure. And as I walked to my car, I was longing for the sense that God was really at work in this world. That's what I was longing for. That's what getting high was about for me. It was about chasing like an adventure, but chasing significance. And this is the real deal. It's in following Jesus that there's a favor of God and a blessing of God, and sort of the significance of life fills up in ways that we never would have expected and never could have imagined. This morning we're going to look at the book of Nehemiah, and we're going to look at a guy with a really, we'll see, challenging personal life who God opens a giant door for. God just pours out his favor on. And so I've called the message, Experiencing God's Favor. We're going to look at that. And I want to pray and then read Nehemiah chapter 2. There you go, Experiencing God's Favor. Lord, at a time when everything seems to be shifting under our feet, at a time when the culture is going forward and backward and all over the place, Lord, would you just set our feet on the rock of your word this morning? Lord, I ask that you pour into our lives. And Holy Spirit, would you come? Would you shine in the places that are discouraged? Lord, I ask that you'd really personally embrace our disappointments this morning. And Lord, that you would swing open the doors in our lives to your favor. Lord, would you help us to be a great blessing in this city? In your name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, we're going to read the very last verse of Nehemiah 1 and then on to Nehemiah 2. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, so this is like 445 BC for those of you who need to know, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but a sadness of the heart. Some translations just say depression. It's a kind of a beautiful phrase in the Hebrew. It's a grieving of the heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? So we found out over the last couple weeks that Nehemiah has heard a report that Jerusalem, which was destroyed by this empire 140 years previously, is still in wreckage. It hasn't been repaired. The people are vulnerable. They're being run over by bandits and wild animals. Things are wrecked. Now notice that Nehemiah's sly here. There's a certain craftiness. When he says this to the king, he doesn't actually mention that it's Jerusalem. Right, because that's a capital city that this empire destroyed on purpose to create a power vacuum so they could have all the money and resources. So Nehemiah just says, why should my face not look sad when the city, not saying what city, the city, is buried in ruins? And the king said to me, what is it that you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. And notice again, he dodges the name. It's just send me to that city. And in the ancient world, if you're speaking to the king, your life is always on the line. If I found favor, that's a yes, that's good. If you're asking to be released from your duty, that could be anything up to the death penalty. So Nehemiah is putting it all on the line here, everything. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me the timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters, and the king also sent army officers and cavalry with me. Now the Bible is full of miracles. If you've read it even casually, you've run into miracles. God parts the Red Sea. God makes the universe out of nothing. God parts the Jordan River and the people walk into the land God promised them. God, when Elijah has a contest with the prophets of Baal, God pours out fire from the sky and consumes the sacrifice. The one gospel, or the one miracle that's in all four gospels is Jesus multiplying the fish and the loaves. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all highlight that miracle, that there were crowds gathered and food is multiplied. Jesus raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. And then after he is crucified, Jesus himself rises from the dead and encounters and empowers and encourages his followers, who then go out and do the miraculous things he told them to do, like driving out demons and healing the sick and preaching the gospel to the poor. But I think this chapter is as much a miracle as most of the things we see in the Bible. God gives Nehemiah favor with a king who, that empire, the Babylonian Empire, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, an empire that was known for its civility, that's known in many ways for being a melting pot and being able to hold together different cultures. The Persian Empire in many ways had wise leaders, and Cyrus and later Artaxerxes was one of those, but it wasn't known for rebuilding capital cities on their own dime. And Nehemiah goes big here. He says, not only do I want to go back and see the city that was ruined, but I want you, O king, to rebuild it on your dime. I want you to open up your stores of timber and give me the wood, and I want you to give me safe passage. And I want to rebuild the city and rebuild the temple. And I probably don't need to tell you that the ancient world was not known for tolerance of other religions. And so Nehemiah is saying, not only do my people want a place to worship, but I want you to build it, king. And he gets the yes. He gets this miraculous favor. And so an insight from this passage that we're going to unpack this morning is that God gives miraculous favor when we seek to bless others, in this case, rebuild the city. But notice that in the Bible, very often, miraculous provision comes with living in the promise that God made to Abraham, I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to the nations. And there's some, Jesus says, whatever you want, ask for it. And when you want a door open, knock and keep on knocking. And so I don't think it's a bad thing to ask when we need things ourselves. But when we see the really miraculous, huge, crazy things happen, it's when we ask on behalf of others. And we're in a couple weeks where we're talking about bringing life to the city, where we're talking about even helping rewrite the story of our city, restoring a city that, although our walls aren't burned down, although we don't have, for the most part, wild animals, are not terrorizing our city streets, the relationships is what I've been highlighting for the last few weeks. I think the relationships are very broken down. We live in a city that's actually plagued by loneliness. We live in a city where many people, and tell me if this is not true, probably if I went around, this would be true for almost all of us. Most of us don't know our immediate neighbors. Most city blocks, even where people have lived there for a long time, don't even actually know the names of the people who live next door to them. If you live in a condo complex, there's a great chance that the people whose parking spaces are next to yours don't even know your name. That's because we live in a city characterized by relational poverty. And I think in many ways, broken down relationships where we've actually forgotten how to have relationships with the people that we live next to. And there's a need for restoration. And Nehemiah, when he asks for great blessing, miraculous blessing to see his city restored, he receives God's favor and the gates swing wide open. And so I want to think this morning, what would it look like for us to ask for and receive God's favor, to be part of God's restoration project? And again, for many of us, city is that's a big picture goal. But as I said last week, if you look around this room, if you're praying for God's restoration in your neighborhood and in your workplace, in your classroom, even in a room this size, we're talking about most of the city. We're talking about workplaces all over the city. We're talking about neighborhoods all over the city. We're talking about classrooms all over the city. And so if we were to take this and actually pray into our own local daily context, just where you spend your time Monday to Friday, we would be talking about actually San Diego and many of the various spheres of life in our city. Okay. So here's the question. How can we experience more of God's favor in our lives and in our city? And we're just going to unpack this chapter, but I want to start with this one little verse about Nehemiah, and with this friendly reminder: don't let your disappointments disqualify you. Because I think a lot of us might be predisposed to not even asking the way Nehemiah asks. When he hears the report, my city's broken down, he asks for basically the king to swing open the doors of the kingdom and to help him in a huge way. And I think for a lot of us, it would be a big leap to ask God for enormous favor. Let's look at this verse. I was a cupbearer to the king. Now, most of us, I don't know what your thoughts about cupbearers were. In the ancient world, there's a couple things I think you need to know about cupbearers. Cupbearers were the ones they brought the food, they brought the wine to the king. If you've ever heard of a beef eater in sort of medieval Europe, cupbearers, among other things, tasted the food, which meant that if the food was poisoned, common way to kill the king, the cupbearer would die first. That's convenient. Cupbearers, though, because they had that role, cupbearers were with the king for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And in the ancient world, treaties, contracts, negotiations, everything you wanted to do was over meals. And that meant the cupbearer was at the king's side at all of the most important moments. And so the cupbearer was actually one of the most important advisors to the king in the ancient world. Might be something like a secretary of state or a vice president today. An insider who was with the king at all times. And so people of really high intelligence, really high achievement were often chosen as cupbearers, and they were often chosen young. And we don't know how it happened, but it could. I bet that Nehemiah was a standout teenager. That's just what I bet. I bet that he was identified for great intelligence for some reason, kind of like today, like if you got a 2,400, a perfect score on the SATs, today you get like a scholarship and college admission. In the ancient world, if you were just someone said that young lad is extraordinarily intelligent, why don't we suggest him as cupbearer? So that's one part of the cupbearer's reality. An advisor, a confidant, a go-between, the one who tested all the food. The other part was that the cupbearer is with the king when he's with the queen and at all the romantic times. When the king, had his alone time, he was there. And so cupbearers in the ancient world were always eunuchs. In fact, in the Septuagint, the oldest version of Nehemiah that we have, Nehemiah is just called the eunuch. And so to be selected as a young Jewish boy living in Babylon also meant that you would be immediately castrated. And as I thought about this chapter this week, I wondered, what would it be like to be a young man identified as having great intelligence and wisdom beyond your years, and then to be told in the ancient world that you were going to be castrated for the king? And I thought, wow, all of his dreams must have gone out the window right there. And in the ancient world, there was no saying no to that selection. Your life was forfeit if you said no. So to be selected as cupbearer, all of a sudden that became your destiny. And I think Nehemiah was a man who knew disappointment as much as any of us will ever know it. Nehemiah was a man who knew what it had to feel like to have your dreams ripped out of your hands. Nehemiah was a man who knew what oppression and injustice felt like. Nehemiah was a man who knew what it was like to be under the power of another person and to feel powerless. And yet, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of being the cupbearer and in the midst of having some privilege and advantage that many people didn't have, his life was sort of a mixture of great privilege, great access, and I'm sure tremendous pain and tremendous grief. And in the midst of that, when he hears the report about the broken down city, Nehemiah finds it in his gut to take it to God, to pray about it, and then to look for God's favor. So we're going to look at that. Michelle and I, this week, just to change the tone a little bit, we went on a date on Friday. I recommend dates to couples, to married couples, to people with children. We went to see The Queen of Katwe, which is a great movie about a Ugandan chess prodigy. And there's a scene in the movie, this is not a spoiler alert, but there's a scene, this young woman named Fiona Mutisi, who lives in the slums outside of Kampala in the city of Katwe, and turns out there's actually a great portrayal of faith in this movie. There's a sort of a local pastor turned chess coach who identifies her amazing talent and starts to get her involved in competitions. And at one point, she and some other kids from the slum go to a boarding school in a rich neighborhood. And the boarding school has beds, and so they're all given a bed for the night, which in the slums they just had floors, no beds. And the coach comes to check on them, and they're all huddled up sleeping on the floor. And that scene struck a real chord in me because when we worked with people living outside, Michelle and I for years led a residential ministry, a house where people lived coming off the streets. And repeatedly we saw when someone was moving off the streets who'd lived on the streets for a long time, they wouldn't sleep on beds we had for them. They would sleep on the floor. If someone had been on the streets just for a little while, they would be so excited to have a bed for the first time in a long time. Man, it's so great to have a bed. I thought everybody would respond that way. But people who lived outside for a long time would often sleep on the floor for weeks or even months because they couldn't sleep on a soft mattress because they weren't used to it. And there's a quote from this kind of believing coach in the movie that I want to highlight. Sometimes the place you are used to is not the place you belong. And I think some of us are so used to disappointment and discouragement that we don't even see ourselves as belonging in God's favor. Like I wouldn't ask for a big blessing because I'm used to discouragement. That's what feels comfortable. I've gotten really used to loss. I think Nehemiah, had just lived with loss and grief in his bones. But it wasn't the place he belonged. And I think for some of us to step into God's favor, to pray for God's favor, to ask for God's favor, to believe that we could be part of rewriting the story of our neighborhood or workplace takes stepping out of what we're used to and stepping out of some of the questions we carry and stepping into a whole new picture of how we relate to God. So, 3 things here. 1, try praying for God's favor. If you want to experience more of God's favor in your life and in the places you are during the week, try praying for it. Nehemiah prays, and in chapter 1, we see this, Hebrew month, Kislev. Most of us don't even know what it's the name of a Hebrew month. And then in this chapter, Nisan, the thing you need to know is it's 4 months. So Nehemiah prays and fasts for 4 months. So he's praying just consistently here until God opens the door. Try seeking God's favor. Try praying for it. Try pouring out your heart for the block you live on. Try pouring out your heart for the team you work with. If you're a school teacher, try pouring out your heart. God, would you just show me favor with my class? Try that prayer. Give me miraculous favor and access to the hearts of the kids that I teach. Try pouring out your heart with whoever you spend Monday to Friday with. If you coach a team, try pouring out your heart. Give me favor with the kids and the families that I coach. If you're part of a regular gym class, give me favor with that. Whatever you do regularly, give me favor, Lord, that you might be lifted up, that relationships might be restored. Jesus, that you might be lifted high. Try praying and asking for God's favor. I'll give you one example. Some of you, many of us have met Nick and Carrie. They're planting a vineyard east of downtown. In January, it's going to launch. They hosted the Bring Life conference that was here. We kind of co-hosted with them, but they were sort of the real leaders if you were here in August. And one of the things that they know that God had put on their heart was to do healing on the streets, which is a sort of prayer model of just praying for people very publicly, anybody who needs prayer, in Balboa Park. And they'd just done a year internship in Ireland, and 2 people in Ireland had pictures of them and said, we see you doing this kind of public healing thing in a park in the center of the city. 2 different people who didn't know each other. So they thought, we're supposed to do this in Balboa Park, we're pretty sure. And so last January, they got in a conversation process with Balboa Park. Can we do healing on the streets? Can we just pray for people? We'd like to just have a banner and pray for people in the middle of Balboa Park. And so they were waiting for permission. They kind of got denied. They got moved around. And we're getting closer to the conference where they wanted to do it for the first time during the August conference, Bring Life, that was here. And they kept praying, and the door wasn't opening, but they were pretty sure, like, we're supposed to bring healing into the heart of the city. They felt like God had really spoken that to them. But nothing opened. Finally, on the Wednesday before the conference, which started on a Thursday, they called Balboa Park for the umpteenth time and said, can we do this thing? And the person they talked to said, of course, you're welcome to. We'd love to have you do it. And this is really a change. And so Thursday morning, they went down and checked, like, are we really allowed to do this? This is like, we were planning to go there kind of as teams out of the conference that was here. So they just wanted to check, like, is this the real deal? Is this really, we're not going to get busted? Is this okay to pray in public? I mean, all kinds of crazy things happen in Balboa Park. If you've been there, right, you can get tarot cards read. You can do any wild thing in Balboa Park. So they're just saying, can we just pray for people who want prayer? Is that going to be okay? And the person said yes. And then the backstory was, and they'd been praying all along, God, open a door, God, open a door, God, open a door. The person who had been saying no, it turns out was saying no only to Christian groups, and someone else had filed a complaint, and they lost their job that week because they were saying no to Christian groups without ever giving reason or cause, and only to Christian groups. And so the new person was like, of course, you're welcome to. That's, I think, God opening a door just in time. There was persistence, there was prayer. But God opened the door. And now they're doing it every week, and great stuff is happening. The church plant's getting ready to take off. Their launch team has been growing. We're looking forward to just kind of cheering them on for a real healthy launch the third week of January. But when we pray and keep on praying, God actually gives us favor for the things he puts on our heart to do. Particularly when we're praying blessing beyond our own lives. Particularly when we're, and again, I don't think you have to pray for the whole city for this to be true. Just try praying for, again, your immediate local context and see what happens. So try praying for God's favor. This is how Nehemiah prays. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I just want to highlight again, as we looked at last week, Nehemiah is specific. Give me favor with this man. And it's interesting, there's a sub-theme, isn't there? This is sort of like a tale of two kings. There's the king of the universe and the king of the Persian Empire. And before God, Nehemiah just calls him this man, this guy, Artaxerxes. Happens to be the most powerful man on the planet at the time. Give me favor in the presence of this man. Okay, so try praying for God's favor. Try pursuing God's favor. Try pursuing it. And here's what it looks like for Nehemiah. So he prays for God's favor, and then the king asks him, why are you so sad? Why do you have this sadness of heart? And Nehemiah is very much afraid. And the reason he's very much afraid is this is the moment that all the chips go on the table. Are you going to ask the king to let you out of your day job as his senior advisor and cupbearer? Are you going to kind of put your whole life on the line for this thing that's been on your heart? And one thing I want to highlight here is actually a lot of times when we start praying for God's blessing, it can get us in trouble right away. If you start praying for your workplace, you might all of a sudden find a conversation that could change the destiny of your job, right? In San Diego, just a small prayer, God bless my workplace. You should only pray that if you're willing to have your life messed with seriously. Because maybe God will open a door, and maybe you'll find yourself right in the threshold like Nehemiah, like, do I walk through this door? I prayed for it, but you know what? Never mind. Never mind. Somebody else can do this. Because I don't want to lose my head because I said something on a bad day for Artaxerxes. But he goes for it. I was very much afraid. So I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? What is it you want? The king says. And I prayed to the God of heaven. And I notice this is probably one of those conversations. It's like we have this really quick. You can read through it. But I love how in the mid-conversation, so the stream's flowing along. What do you want? I prayed to the God of heaven. You ever had one of those conversations where someone asks you a question? It's like, Jesus, give me an answer to that question right now. Like in real time. So Nehemiah's just talking to the king. But in the midst of the conversation, I prayed to the God of heaven. And I answer the king, if it pleases the king, which is a wise way to start. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor, and there's a theme through this whole chapter of finding the favor of God by finding favor in earthly authorities. Let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. And so what Nehemiah is doing is he's pursuing. He's not only praying for God's favor, he's stepping through that open door. He's going after it. Okay, God, now is where I'm going to chase your favor. I'm going to put it in action. That thing I've been praying, I'm going to go for it. Nehemiah is not just praying, God, rebuild Jerusalem and do it somehow. He's praying for himself to be part of the process. And I think a lot of us, I know my tendency here would be like, God, would you please put it on the king's heart to rebuild Jerusalem? Because that's a lot easier than actually saying, would you bless me to be a part of the solution? Would you give me favor? And for Nehemiah, that might challenge his whole way he thinks about himself. As a man who's never, ever going to get married, as a man who's never going to have kids, as a man who's never going to live with his friends in his community again, as a man who probably didn't live a pain-free day in his adult life. God, would you show me favor? And he seeks the Lord. Now, what would asking for God's favor just in our local lives look like? Because most of us aren't going to have an audience with the president. Some of us these days would not want an audience with the president, but we're not going to probably have an audience with the president or the mayor of San Diego. But what would it look like to pursue God's favor in our neighborhoods and our workplaces? I'll give you just a couple pictures. Joe and Jenny Pace, who are over with the youth, they have a Friendsgiving party every year. Like they just have their whole block together on Thanksgiving, and people come out. I've been once, like the whole neighborhood, they've been doing it year after year. And now the neighborhood knows each other, and some of us have been to these. Like there's a real connection, and actually Jesus has gotten lifted up. They've had a chance to pray for many of their neighbors, and the whole neighborhood looks forward to it and is owning it. That, I think, is going from, God, would you do something in our neighborhood, to I'm actually going to pursue it. I'm going to invite people over. And that sounds maybe simple. That's not quite like asking the king to open his treasury. But if you think about it, if you live in one of those condo complexes where nobody knows each other, it's weird even to say, hey, would you come to a party? Hasn't it? We've gotten to the place of relational breakdown where it's weird to ask even a block down, hey, we're just going to have a party. That can feel like, whoa, why are you in my space? Why are you at my door? It opens up like rejection and all those things that we might or might not want to experience. And yet what's happening in the midst of that is reconnected relationships, opportunities to pray for people, opportunities for Jesus to be lifted up, opportunities for relationships to be reconnected. That's pursuing God's favor just on a local block. And I think we need a lot more of that. Like we need workplaces where we're pursuing God's favor, where we're stepping towards it. So let's imagine, how are the ways, where could you ask for God's favor and then go after it, as Nehemiah does? Okay, last point. Nehemiah pursues God's favor. He also plans for God's favor. Try planning for God's favor. And here's what I mean. When the king says, what do you want? Nehemiah is not caught flat-footed. He doesn't just say, God, have favor on Jerusalem. He thinks, what would this take? And so when the king says, what do you want? This is what Nehemiah says. If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive. So Nehemiah's thought, this is the journey between me and the restoration that I think God wants to accomplish. This is the journey into the story. God's rewriting the story of an entire city through Nehemiah. And Nehemiah thinks, here's the journey, so give me letters so that I can get there. And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, basically the king's forest, so that he'll give me timber. So Nehemiah's thought, here's where I need to go, and then here's what I'm going to need when I get there. So Nehemiah has planned this thing out. And I think oftentimes in the church there's an unfortunate divide between people who pray and people who plan. Have you ever experienced that? Christians have a weird sort of bifurcation. Like there's the spiritual people who just pray, and then there's the strategic people who just plan. And the Bible consistently shows us the two together. Like Nehemiah prays for God's favor, but he also plans. He's got an answer in mind. If this door swings open, this is what I'm going to want. This is what I'm going to need. And he goes for it. We want to be a church that does both. I read last year, I shared all these stories from 19th century women who have become my heroes. I'm going to roll one more out this morning. I want to introduce you. There's a woman named Martha, and she went by just Mother Lee. She was born in 1842. Her parents grew up in Kentucky. They were like pro-slavery South. She had a really hard early life. She got married as a young teenager, which in her writings, she's like really against. So you can tell it wasn't the best marriage, but she got married as a teenager. She had several children. They went through the Civil War, and for several reasons. It sort of ended up on the side of the North, but her family was torn apart by the Civil War. Her husband ended up dying when she was a young woman. She was widowed. And her pension, the government gave very short pensions to widows, and so it only lasted a couple years. And so she ended up in Omaha, Nebraska, as a widow with several kids running out of money. She had a radical encounter with Jesus in her mid-40s. You sort of think sometimes of the 19th century Midwest as a place where everybody knew Jesus. It was actually exactly the opposite. There were very few churches. Churches were still developing across. They were mostly like whiskey drinking, very hard. She lived in a place called Hell's Half Acre. So that tells you something about it. There was this Christian imagination, but it was a mess. Anyway, she met Jesus, and the folks that she met Jesus with prayed for her for a chest condition she had because she'd been a pipe smoker for her entire life. You can just imagine, 19th century committed pipe smoker, meets Jesus. She's radically healed. She decides to pray for her mom for a sickness her mom had, and her mom is miraculously healed. She gets excited. She prays for her nephew who's got a deformed limb, and he was instantly healed. And she committed as a result of seeing God move in power to serve the poor however she could for the rest of her life. And so she went muddling around Omaha with the folks who had led her to Jesus, and she found herself in a brothel. And one of the women in the brothel asked her a question, and she said, "You can't be saying that there's rescue or salvation for people who have fallen as low as us." And that question haunted her for a couple of years. And she struggled to believe, as a woman who barely was able to put food on her own table, that God could actually help people who had fallen lower than she did. And she met another widow who had some rooms open in her house and said, "If you open the rooms in your house, could we start a rescue home for prostitutes and unwed mothers?" And the other widow said yes. And so two widows got together and they opened their home. Shortly after that, a 9-bedroom home opened and they got a larger home. And then she did something really remarkable at age 50, 1892. She decided to pursue nonprofit status in the state of Nebraska. And she started her own nonprofit and started asking for donations. And that launched what was called for many years Goodwill Mission. And she opened homes in Wichita and in Kansas and across the Midwest, and it became a huge source of life for prostitutes and unwed mothers in the middle of our country at the end of the 19th century. But it took a widow who was living in poverty, who was desperate, who'd had a radical salvation experience in her 40s, and who learned to pray. But it also took someone who had the planning thought that I need to start a nonprofit in order to get money, in order to help more women than I could possibly help on my own. And I think we need to see that reignited in the church, where we're really committed in prayer. And she had this great board, and they had this conviction that whatever God had promised, he would do. And so it's like they prayed, but then they had a conviction God will bring in the resources for the things that he's promised, which in their case was rescue for the poorest of the poor, the desperate people in her generation. We want to be a church that prays, but also is not afraid to plan big, is not afraid to go after the things that take changing the structures of our city. Well, I want to go back to Nehemiah's pain and his disappointments and his discouragements, because I think for many of us, stepping forward into the favor of God, especially asking for favor over something like our workplace, many of us work in the context of huge corporations, nationally known corporations, or universities that are world-renowned. How would we ask God to transform something huge? And I think it takes like a gut check. I want to finish with this verse from Hebrews. So this is Nehemiah gets the favor. He ends up going. I'm going to jump over that. Hebrews chapter 4. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. What Hebrews is telling us is that if you know Jesus, the favor of God is within reach. Whatever questions Nehemiah might have had, like, is the favor of God really in reach? And Nehemiah is reaching back to the promises given to Moses. God, these are the promises you gave to Moses. Let them be true. In Jesus, we know that he has gone before us, that he is at the right hand of the Father, and that because he died and rose again, we have access to the King of all kings, and we have access to the throne that matters the most. And the encouragement is to go in with confidence. And that's where I want to call us this morning, to go before the throne of grace with confidence, because we have a great high priest named Jesus. Let's all stand. Worship team, if you guys want to come on up. We're going to finish with a song of worship and an opportunity to get prayer. If you feel persistently discouraged, just give me a chance to get prayer after worship. But I think God really wants to break the power of discouragement. And even where discouragement has become identity, if you feel like, man, my life, it's just hard for me to even think about reaching for God's favor, we'd love to pray for it. I think God wants to release some folks this morning. We've also spent the morning talking about God opening doors for us. There's an interesting picture, though, in Revelation where it says Jesus is knocking on the door of our hearts, and the invitation is for us to open the door. If you don't know Jesus this morning, there might not be just an invitation to look for a door God is opening, but actually to open the door of your own heart to Him. You're coming at the beginning of a spiritual journey. As we sing this song, I encourage you just to reflect on what it would look like to open the door of your heart to Jesus and to allow Him to come in, to be with you and to love you. Let's worship. I want to invite us to come up in maybe a couple groups. If you are feeling discouraged, maybe stuck in grief, if you're in a place where asking for God's favor just seems like a reach, we'd love to pray for you. We'd love to ask God to bring healing there. I'm just going to be bold in this one. If you feel that way, I just invite you to come up on this side. Just no shame there, but just an acknowledgement. There's stuff going on that makes it tough for me to even want to pray. When you say pray for a workplace or city, there's so much going on for me that would be really hard. Just invite you to come on up. You could even respond right now. Just if you're feeling like, that's going to be tough for me, we'd love to pray with you. I want to invite on this side another group. If you have a kind of a burning sense as we're talking about God's favor, I know where I want it. I want to see it in my workplace. I want to see it in my business. I want to see it over our city in the area of trafficking. I want to see it, my neighborhood. I want to see it. If you have a place that's coming alive for you, we'd love to pray just with you for a release of God's favor. So if that's you, if there's something just leaping in your heart, we'd love to just join with you and pray. And if you're at the beginning of a spiritual journey, we'd love to pray with you up here. If you aren't even sure what it would look like to begin a relationship with the living God, we would love to pray with you. If you've never opened the door of your heart and said, Jesus, come in, we would love to pray with you. Yeah. Let's hold hands across the aisles. We do this each week as a reminder that we are a community. We're a community representing many communities. But we're a community with one Lord whose name is Jesus, filled with one Spirit. We are one body. So, Lord, would you let your love flow over us now, even as we hold hands across the aisles? Let your love flow over us, Lord. Would you give us right now just a small taste of your favor, Lord? Would you show us just right now that you, the very God who swung open the doors for Nehemiah to be part of a restoration probably bigger than he could have imagined as a young man, you're with us now. Jesus, we thank you for your presence. We thank you that you are risen from the dead. We thank you that nothing we have done could ever disqualify us, Lord, because on the cross you defeated sin and the plans of the enemy. We love you, Jesus, and we go out in your name. Amen. God bless you guys. If you'd like prayer, come on up. If you're headed out, have a fantastic week.